Okay, so this video is titled Carrying Capacity of Trauma. And this is something that it's a concept that I've derived through my experience of my own traumatic past and learning how to deal with it and processing through that. And I'm using a concept called, was it the carrying capacity? And so the carrying capacity is essentially the amount of organisms that an environment can hold given its resources. It's the maximum amount of organisms that environment can hold given its resources. And at a certain point, the environment can't sustain more than that number. And so as the population starts to decline because it's just unsustainable and it collapses. And I want to use this line of thought to talk about something that I've thought about called the carrying capacity of trauma. And I think this works for other things too, such as like joy or love. It's not doesn't necessarily trauma, but it's more just the carrying capacity of the mind. The capacity. And so here's what I mean by this. What I think is that at a certain point, the mind can only hold so much traumatic experience that it reaches a critical number or a critical point. Critical point. Oh. So at a certain point, when someone experiences a lot of trauma, it reaches a critical point where they have to do something other than internalize what they're experiencing. And how I've experienced this is, so my childhood and upbringing was very traumatic. I was in a lot of high stress, high intensity at home environments. Some were very verbally abusive, others were physical. And I experienced a lot of aggression constantly as a kid. I remember going to sleep listening to screaming, for nights on end between my mom and her partners, and just feeling that constant level of stress. And this has continued from when I was maybe 6 until when I was about 8, 19 years old. So solid 13 years. And, over this time, a lot of trauma compounded, and I internalized a lot of what I experienced because I didn't know how to understand it growing up. And this reached a critical point after high school when COVID struck, and I also moved to Davis. So where I'm basically I moved away from my hometown and away from all of the experiences that came with that. And so I had a fresh start. COVID just hit, so I had unlimited time to sort of process my own emotions, kind of feel myself out, and become more in touch with myself. And I realized that almost all of my behaviors were all of my behaviors stemmed from certain experiences in my life which shaped me to respond out of trauma. I was always in constant fight or flight mode when interacting with people, and I would interpret very innocent things as threats. I would get triggered if people, made certain jokes or had certain mannerisms, and it was interesting because I didn't act out a lot of my triggering my triggered emotions. I was able to kind of maintain it, but there came a point where I was waking up every day in a fight or flight mode with a racing heart, and I realized that I had to do something about it. I believe that I reached a carrying capacity for trauma in myself, where there was so much grief and so much pain and so much, rage and frustration from everything that's happened to me thus far in my life, where 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 I was not able to maintain it anymore with the same behaviors that I did until then. What I mean by that is, for 13 years, I was able to kind of mask my trauma. I was able to create a persona, a very successful persona at school of a very outgoing personality, very, energetic and loving person. And, that stems from a true desire to, be someone who could take care of others. But at the same time, it kept me from really processing through what I was dealing with at the time. Moreover, I didn't have the, time or space or, skills or even understanding of what I was going through at the time, when I was younger, to know that I was being traumatized. And so anyways, it's the year's 2021, and I'm fresh out of high school. I'm not going to college, and I just have so much time to think about everything that happened in my life. And so I started to process through it. I started to read books about trauma, read books about how children who lived in very alcoholic households, children who lived in households with alcoholics, sort of develop and develop behaviors as a result of the environment that they're in, and how they learn to respond to other people's anger, how they learn to be more agreeable and kind of survive in that environment, and how certain behaviors become maladaptive after they get out of that environment and into a more healthy space. Maladaptive meaning animals adapt to their situation in order to survive, whether that be out in nature or in modern day society. We develop a persona, we change aspects of ourselves to fit the people around us so that things go smoothly. However, those habits become maladaptive when we're put in a new environment, and all the behaviors that we have created no longer work in this new environment given new circumstances. And I had a lot of maladaptive behaviors as a response of how I grew up. I spent the past year or so really trying to process through that and understand it from a place of not being judgmental, truly understand it for what it is and kind of see it in all of its light without being biased to the best of my ability. And what I found was, first, that it was immensely hard. It was deeply difficult, and it required a lot of courage to confront all of the demons that plagued my life. And I had to take it one day at a time, and often I was overwhelmed by all of the sort of chaos and ambiguity of my mind. It was like every day I operated in a heavy fog of thoughts, some tormenting, some grieving, some very insecure, some very angry, and it was just this cloud of emotion, and it was something that I didn't understand. And so there was a part of me that was the mask, that was my persona, where I could go about my everyday life, I could interact with people, and I could be normal on the outside. However, internally I was suffering. I was not at peace, and it led to a lot of psychosomatic expression, whether it be the waking up in fight or flight mode constantly, or being constantly triggered by certain things that happen around me, and feeling that I wasn't safe in my environment, feeling that I always had to watch out for people and be very hyper vigilant to make sure that no one did me wrong, to make sure that no one kind of had leverage on me that could hurt me. And yes, I believe I reached a critical point where I could no longer sustain the trauma just by acting like it wasn't there, just by acting in spite of it. I had to really dive into the ocean of unknown and start to sort it out and start to articulate it and learn different words, learn different theories, and kind of tame all of that amorphous blob into a more refined and understandable entity. And so that's what I did. I read books. One is, Alcoholic Children. No, it's Adult Children of Alcoholics. That was a really good book. It taught me a lot about how I kind of learned to behave growing up in alcoholic environments. I watched videos. I can't count how many videos I've watched about psychology. I watched psychiatrists at work, talking with other people. I learned words like projecting. I learned things about how people act out of insecurity, and I started to gain more knowledge that I could associate with trying to understand all of the trauma inside of my mind. And I started to dissect it, and I started to work with it and understand it. And what I found is that the demons that I faced were not actually monsters. Rather, they were me. They were parts of me at different points along my life. Whether 5 years old or 13 years old, they were all different ages, different parts of me that were very hurt and that did not understand what was going on. And I kept these parts of me. You kind of keep it, and you don't really grow past it, and you harbor all of these things. And so the experience of processing through my trauma was the experience of me starting to confront different parts of me and to have conversation with them, whether that be conversation through to have conversation, and sometimes that meant literal conversation with myself, talking to myself as if I was talking to the younger part of who I was. For example, when I was 10, I would, around the age when I was like about 8, 9, 10 onwards, I would go home every day. My mom would be fighting with her boyfriend at the time. They'd just be yelling back and forth for hours. Literally hours. And I'd fall asleep to that every single night for months on end. Months. And, something I had to do was I had to talk to myself as if I was talking to that kid back then. Tell him that it wasn't his fault. I had to explain the situation of how, neither my mom nor her boyfriend really knew how to communicate well with each other, nor were they compatible, and how they had, lots of unsorted insecurity and trauma of their own that they projected through that, aggression. And I had to kind of hold my hand and show myself that right here, this is what this was. And what that did is it allowed me to, let's see, I don't even know if my camera is covering this. Oh wow, my camera might have been covering the thing that I wrote. It's right here. I was just writing notes as I talked. So I had to kind of explain to myself what I went through. And through that, I understood my trauma, to the best of my ability. And from there, I was able to form a map. I was able to map out, historic events in my life to present day behaviors and see how the string of events grew as I interacted with more people throughout my life. As I started to fall in love with people, as I got my heart broken, as I learned how to behave around others, I could map out the way that I acted in certain situations to how I learned to survive in some core event of my life. And so I've done that. I've been doing that for the past year actively, and I found a lot of meaning there. I found a lot of, it's been very fulfilling. And through that, I've learned to articulate better how I feel. Something that, really was difficult for me was talking to others about my true emotions and not trying to appease other people, and talking about how I felt genuinely. And in sorting out my traumas and understanding my insecurities, understanding my desires to please people or to not create conflict, I was able to set context for how to better articulate myself and what to strengthen in myself, whether that be being more confrontational, whether that be allowing myself to feel a certain way without shame, feel anger without being ashamed of it, feel frustration without being ashamed of it, and really sort of understand the role of all of these emotions, right? Because growing up in a volatile environment with a lot of aggression, anger, you don't realize that every emotion has power and can be harnessed and used effectively. All I knew growing up is that people got angry. People got very angry, and if I didn't know how to, and often I didn't know how to do anything. I didn't know what to do about it. So I had choices to either run from it or to act like it wasn't there, or to appease the other person and kind of push back a little bit, push back the fire, kind of contain it, but never to understand it, never to solve it, never to trying to figure out why they feel a certain way. And so in processing and trying to understand why people acted a certain way, I've been able to not only be better at articulating myself, but be better at understanding other people's problems, other people's hardships that they face, and being empathetic towards it, being compassionate. And that's allowed me to have better conversation with those around me. That's allowed me to resolve a lot of conflict internally and externally, as well as prevent a lot of conflict from occurring, whether that be with my friends or whether that be with me in trying to hold everything in and deal with it all on my own. I got better at communicating, and that was really nice. And so the reason why I want to make this video is because yesterday I had a conversation with a friend, and we were at a smoothie shop, and we were sitting there, her drinking a coffee, I'm drinking a smoothie, and she told me that what would make this day better is if she had a bagel. However, she felt guilt in buying a bagel because how she was raised was she put her parents' needs before hers constantly because they didn't have a lot of money growing up. And now she associates spending money with wasting her parents' hard work, something like that, or there's a guilt associated with spending the money that her parents have given her to spend in college, because for so long she she had to sacrifice her needs in order to relieve the pressure, on the household as a kid. And I really wondered. I wondered why, even though she knew, you know, even though she knew that her shame in buying a bagel was not that her shame in buying a bagel was a maladaptive, reaction to her environment, that now that she's in a more stable place, and that her parents, and she said that her parents want her to spend the money because they earn it for her to spend. And I was thinking about how you could know that something was, the word I want to say is wrong. However, I don't know if that's the right word. I because the behavior is not wrong. It's just it does not it is not effective for the current circumstance. So knowing that she's behaving in a way that's knowing that she's expressing maladaptive behaviors, how come she's not doing anything about it? How come she I talked to her about voluntary confrontation, where psychiatrists will have their patients can willingly confront the things that scare them, because it doesn't work if you force the patient to do something. They must slowly build up and confront those things that scare them, and eventually, through that voluntary confrontation, they're able to heal. So I asked my friend, why not just buy the bagel? Or I'll buy the bagel and we can split the cost and we'll share the bagel. I try to give solutions for I try to construct a path towards understanding why she felt the shame. Or perhaps I tried to build a path out of the shame that she felt in doing something as simple as buying a bagel. But she did not want to, and I didn't push any farther, because that's not my place to do so. But I have wondered the whole day about this, and why last year I realized, that all of the traumas in my life, that I decided that I had to fix them, that I had to start to understand and dissect myself, and recreate and relearn who I was. And I wondered why she wasn't doing that. And so that brought up the, I was able to derive the idea of the carrying capacity of trauma, right? Carrying capacity of trauma. And I believe that last year I reached a critical point where I had so much traumatic experience that I had internalized that I could no longer sustain existing with and prolonging those behaviors, the behaviors that stemmed from those experiences. And so I had to start dissecting and processing through all of it. It's like a critical point, and there's an inflection where you can either solve it, or you could collapse, or you could try to push past, but that doesn't really work, at least to my knowledge. And so I thought of this concept of the carrying capacity of trauma, and I realized that not everyone is at that point yet. Not everyone is at the point where allowing for maladaptive behaviors becomes unbearable. And for me, it did. For me, it did, which is the reason why, I decided to start to heal, or I guess not decide to start to heal. That wasn't my intention in the beginning. Decided to start to try to understand and change myself. And I reached a point where just, all of the pain inside of me started to take over my life, and I couldn't function. I could not function. And I was being overwhelmed constantly. And my environment could not sustain doing that any longer, so I had to change. And yeah, so that's the idea that I've derived, is that we have that every individual has a tolerance for the things that they experience. And I'm talking about trauma in this video, because that is what that's just what's been on my mind lately, right? So everyone has a certain threshold of the trauma that they can tolerate, and the trauma that they can put off confronting, up until a certain point where it becomes too unbearable, or when it starts to leak out into other aspects of their life and ruin what they are trying to do, what they're striving for, and start to kind of just corrupt their whole identity. Yes, maybe some people never reach that point. I don't know, and I don't know if it's necessary to get at that inflection point in order to realize that you want to change something. But what I know is that I did. I reached the point where I had to change. And maybe people that realize that they're they realize that there are things that need to be fixed but don't do it, perhaps they're just not at the point of not being able to sustain otherwise, not being able to sustain not doing otherwise. Does that make sense? Perhaps they're not at a point where they are forced to confront themselves and figure out I don't know how to explain the thought I just had right now. But perhaps the people that don't that aren't seeking change while being aware of their trauma, there's not, because they still have room to sustain not doing otherwise. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And so, I don't know. That's just, yeah, that's what I've been thinking. Yeah. Well, if you watched up until now, thank you for watching. Yeah, cool.